Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that very kind, generous introduction. I'm Sandy Davis. I'm a senior advisor here with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Joined with my colleague Tim Shaw, a senior policy analyst there as well. And we're here today to talk to you all about this report we've been working on for a while on ideas for advancing an evidence-based culture in Congress. I'd also, before I start, like to particularly thank the Laura and John Arnold Foundation for their support for this work. It's been instrumental in us being able to do this, and we really thank them for their support and their counsel as we work through this. In this effort, what we've attempted to do is to take a broad look at how Congress uses evidence in the policymaking process and the ways to encourage greater use of that evidence. And of course, the underlying premise of all this is that evidence-based policymaking, or essentially the use of rigorous research on how policies and programs function, how they work, to inform decisions about how those policies and those programs should be structured or how they can be improved, should be the basis for federal policymaking in the 21st century, regardless. It should be a fundamental basis for policymaking. Now, our effort, as Michael and Bill mentioned, sort of broadly paralleled that of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. The Commission, which, as we said, made its final recommendations last fall, however, focused principally on organizing and better structuring the use of data held by the executive branch, by the federal government. Our effort has focused on a parallel effort to suggest a set of ideas that's more appropriate for Congress in using the evidence that's being generated and suiting it to the unique needs of the legislative branch. So in doing this, we had many conversations with key folks on Capitol Hill. Two of whom are on the panel that you're going to listen to next. Ryan Martin and Holly Harvey were very instrumental in some early and ongoing conversations on practical uses for evidence in Congress. And the takeaway a broad takeaway from those conversations with them and with others is that there is a broad bipartisan support for expanding the use of evidence in the legislative process. And while it has been mentioned that there have been some significant achievements in incorporating evidence-based requirements in legislation, most recently in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, we have discovered some natural barriers in the legislative process to the routine use of evidence to inform policymaking. We discussed those barriers broadly in Volume 1 of our report, which was issued a couple of weeks ago, and copies of which are back there as well. And what we said in that volume was that these barriers sort of coalesce into three broad categories. Barriers about the perception of the utility of evidence among lawmakers, whether or not it's valuable, whether or not it makes sense to them and is usable in the legislative process. Then there's barriers within the institution of Congress, how it's organized to function, its fragmented nature with fragmented committees of jurisdiction and its budget process, which doesn't necessarily correspond with the way evidence is developed. And then there are systemic barriers that are related to sort of the norms, the conventions, the way Congress works, like matching up the timing of legislation with the availability and use of evidence and research that's available. So while these are barriers, however, they do suggest a range of options and ideas that could encourage more consistent use of evidence in Congress. And because we like the number 3, we organize these into 3 broad buckets as well. So these options fall, first of all, into options that we feel would build congressional capacity to use evidence. Options in number 2 that would modify its institutions to make that evidence more transparent to deal with the perception issue in particular. And then options to modify legislative procedures and processes more generally to incentivize the use of this evidence that's made available. I'd like to make clear that these are options and not recommendations. Often BPC will issue a report with a task force making recommendations on a set of policies. We didn't do that in this case. I think we felt like in this case a more helpful thing was to present a range of options that then lawmakers could decide to move forward with if they chose in the most appropriate way, depending upon how they use evidence. I mean, these are intended to be conversation starters, essentially. It doesn't cover everything, and I'm sure you all have lots of ideas and things. Well, why didn't you include this? Why didn't you include that? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but these are conversation starters. And I think the broad principle behind this essential approach is that because of the nature of Congress as an institution, creating a broad and consistent culture of evidence probably requires multiple approaches to deal with these multiple barriers. So, without further ado, we're going to turn now to a discussion, give you an overview of our set of options in the three categories. And I'm going to turn to my colleague Tim now to take on the task of talking about the options for capacity enhancement and institutional modifications that we thought of. And then I'm going to discuss some options about process changes that we think would also incentivize evidence use. So, Tim?
Thanks, Andy. And thank you all for coming. We're going to do a broad overview of each of the sections. Obviously, we have 19 options in this volume, so not going to get into every one in particular. That will take too much time, but you all have copies of the report. But I'll start with capacity options, give a broad overview of what they are, and highlight a few that we think are important either for the feasibility that we think could happen or that are a good demonstration of the type of option and the type of problems we are looking to solve as part of the creation of these options. So first, an overview of the capacity options. These are really designed to think through what could better facilitate Congress's ability to take in the evidence that does already exist either in the research community or in the executive branch and build a better and easier pipeline to get that into the decision-making process. And these options fall broadly into three buckets. There's increasing the useful connections between Congress and researchers, which we heard a lot from our interviews about barriers between those two institutions. Increasing the usefulness of the actual information that Congress has available and make sure it's tailored to the specific process that Congress has to use to make decisions and make sure that information is available at the right time. Timing was a big issue that we heard. And lastly, increasing the number of experts working for Congress and the training that staff are able to get in order to develop that expertise. This report is coming out at a time when the available resources and staffing available to Congress has been on a slow decline for quite some time. Congressional staff can attest they only have so many hours in a day to really dig into all of the really deep knowledge that's been built in the research community and in the executive branch around these issues. And so really developing that staff capacity could help. We have a couple that we'd like to highlight. And these try to balance a couple of key frustrations that we heard that were kind of dueling in the research and the congressional staff community. The first is that, like I said, there's a deep body of work that's done. The Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking focused a lot on how we can better build evidence in the executive branch and what are the barriers to that. But that's not to say that a lot of good work and a lot of good research isn't already happening. And for folks who are actually building that, when we talk to them, who are building that evidence base, they were concerned about how to better get that evidence into congressional processes. So it wasn't always clear to them how to best do that and get it into the hands of decision makers to improve those decisions. On the flip side, though, congressional staff were often talked about how to get that information in a useful form. Diving into a peer-reviewed report for specific articles that might contain a lot of jargon, that might not be written specifically for policy recommendations is difficult. And it isn't well tailored to the process. It isn't necessarily available on the time frame they need to make decisions. And so the options that we have here try to help address those two issues. The first I'll highlight is our option for creating a Congressional Evidence Fellowship Program. And we highlight this because we think a lot of good work has gone on in this area, and so there are good models for doing this in the future. The AAAS Fellowship Program in particular is a good example of how these things have been run successfully. Elena Flanagan will be here on our second panel to talk through her experience. as a AAAS fellow, but we also think establishing a specific congressional program for evidence-based fellows would be quite useful, on top of the existing fellowships in a few ways. One, tailoring the program to the congressional context and having Congress actually design the program could help Congress better fit it into the legislative process and time the fellowships at a point when they are going to be most useful to the process. Second, by its very nature, such a program would have to be bipartisan. So we are the Bipartisan Policy Center, after all, and all these private fellowships are kind of a grab bag from a lot of different places, and they can be placed into partisan offices, and there's no one kind of managing that process and making sure that members of all parties and committees, sides of all parties, have access to that level of expertise. This would help that. It would also boost funding for that level of expertise in Congress. Again, it'd be important for these fellows to be timed specifically to legislation, and this is one of the key things that we think for all of these options is a key piece of consideration, making sure that at the time the congressional staff can and need to call up someone who knows that information, they have that person available and easily accessible. The second thing I want to highlight is a much more difficult process to undertake, but we also think could be high impact if it was executed well. And that's establishing a protocol in the authorization process for including evidence in a timely fashion from the executive branch, validating that information through Congress's existing legislative service organizations, and then pairing that with some sort of extra expertise in the evidence process. That's a lot of moving parts, right? But we do think it's very important. In addition to the research community, the executive branch obviously does a lot of work to build evidence for its programs and its decision-making and works with Congress regularly to make decisions. But again, all of that research isn't always well timed to the authorizations process. It's made by a set of decision makers that don't have the same consideration as the policymakers in Congress. The idea here is when you start up when you're finishing up an authorization that you know is going to be reauthorized sometime later, that embedded in that legislation, you create a timeline knowing that you're going to have to come to similar questions and request that the agencies provide some level of the evidence they've collected over the long term on the successful implementation, the key insights from their research that they've been getting as part of developing those programs and researching them, and provide them to Congress at a time that would be useful. So this would have to be decided by committee staff. We're working on it closely. The kind of model we gave is 2 years ahead of a reauthorization, provide what level of evidence is available at that time. That evidence would then be passed through a validation process to the Government Accountability Office, is the group that we've suggested as this option could do that. And this is in part because at any given time, obviously, some congressional staff will be on the opposite party of the administration. There needs to be a way that Congress knows it can trust the information that's being passed from the executive branch to their hands and kind of really validate that process. And GAO is having worked there before. GAO is very well equipped to go in and talk to congressional staff of what their specific needs are, and they already have rigorous processes for taking a look at underlying data, underlying studies, and validating them and coming up with and identifying the strengths of that of the underlying research and evidence. That also then allows that research to be repackaged in a way that's specifically designed for congressional use. So that step would be its own validation process, and the last would be hiring some sort of staff member who is an expert on these processes to be a facilitator in the last really, the crunch time for actually developing legislation that can be a conduit between the committee staff, congressional staff, research institutions, and GAO to be on hand for the crafting of legislation and really fill out that process. That could happen in a number of ways. It would be good to partner with this fellowship program if it was in existence. GAO regularly sends detailees or people on temporary assignment to committees that can support in this manner if it fits within their resource allocations and they're given sufficient time to make those determinations. And so we really see this as a way to fill in all the gaps that we identified. A lot of the different options in this particular section answer those questions in different ways. This one in particular, again, is a lot of moving parts, but kind of fills all the gaps that we see in that particular process and can be very helpful. I move on briefly to the institutional part of our recommendations, and these are places where we took a look at the actual structures in Congress and see whether and where there could be additions to help in the transparency of how evidence is used in decision-making, as well as build up those structures to better facilitate the increase of evidence flow into Congress. The one I'll highlight here is an option for a joint committee on evidence. This one would be modeled after the Joint Committee on Taxation or the Joint Economic Committee, and it would really be focused on providing oversight of the executive branch's evidence-based activities. In particular, we see a link here to the Commission's report. The Commission's report recommended a number of processes and additions to executive branch agencies, such as chief evaluation officers and chief data officers that would oversee the evidence-building processes in Congress. And to signal that there's a good congressional oversight and support for these initiatives, a joint committee on evidence would oversee those activities and making sure they're executed well and building the kind of evidence that we hope is incorporated well into policymaking decisions in the executive branch. It would also be helpful to get a sense from Congress as to the state, their view and oversight on the state of evidence building in the executive branch on an annual basis, and provide a natural pipeline of folks, of senators and congressmen who are actively engaged on the issue of evidence building, to provide that pipeline of leadership that is so important to make sure that evidence continues to be part of the culture of Congress. So those are the kind of high-level options I wanted to highlight. I'll turn it back to Sandy to go over our process options.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm just going to briefly highlight some of the key process options we think worth focusing on. And then in a few minutes, we'll open it up for questions before we turn to our second panel. So for our looking at process changes, our broad thinking here, and in talking to staff and others, was that one of the key things you could do in modifying congressional process was the idea of sort of creating space for evidence in the legislative agenda and the legislative timetable and schedule. And part of that also goes to aligning the legislative schedule more closely to evidence building and to enhance the opportunity for more comprehensive approaches to using evidence, to sort of separate it out somehow from the daily routine. I think what also informed our thinking on this is the mere fact that Congress is really essentially a two-year institution. There are biennial elections, there are 2 sessions of Congress, and so I think that evidence generation and use needs to sort of accommodate itself to this kind of cycle of activity in Congress. So the ideas and options that are in the report that I wanted to focus on briefly are biennial budgeting, biennial evidence plans, matching authorization cycles to the cycle of evidence, and portfolio reviews. So biennial budgeting, you may be thinking, well, what the heck has biennial budgeting got to do with evidence-based policymaking? Funny you should ask. So the fundamental underpinning of biennial budgeting, when you think about it, is that all budgetary actions, appropriations, budget resolutions, spending and revenue legislation should occur in the first session or in a single session of Congress. And that the other session of that Congress should be devoted principally to oversight, to authorizations, to broader policy questions. And this is the place where evidence is really most effective and most useful, is in that broader policy discussion and in that oversight discussion. So biennial budgeting essentially would sort of create the space that could be useful for a broader examination of evidence. And it's not necessarily that the evidence would mature or become available on a 2-year cycle. That's not what we're saying, but having the expectation that there's a part of the legislative agenda, a separate session that's dedicated, that accommodates the evaluation of research and evidence in a legislative setting, I think is an important signal to send about the priority for evidence-based policymaking in Congress. I think this also supports the notion, the long-standing notion under congressional procedures that policy decisions really should be separate from budgetary decisions. The long-standing tradition of separate authorizations and appropriations, going back to the very beginning of the Republic, establishes the broad concept that policy should be made first and then the funding decisions should follow from that. And this is also the case with evidence when you think about it. The key questions for using evidence, evidence-based policymaking is how programs can be structured or improved based on good research, and then that the funding decisions should then be made based on this information. So biennial evidence plans. Biennial evidence plans for authorizing committees is a new idea that we developed. And this would also pair with the rhythm of a two-year Congress and a biennial budget approach. And this option calls for authorizing committees at the beginning of a Congress to develop an evidence and research plan that would identify some of the key research questions for upcoming oversight activities, for upcoming authorizations, either in that Congress or in future Congresses. It could be a rolling plan where it's updated periodically for new research. And the authorizing committees are really the natural, as Tim alluded to, the natural focus for evidence use in Congress. They have the jurisdiction over the programs, they focus on policy, and they have sort of a longer view than is typical in the annual appropriations process. But recent breakdowns in the authorization process, as CBO annually chronicles in its report on unauthorized appropriations, is keeping those committees really from a more systematic of oversight and effective use of evidence. So, and part of the disconnect, we feel like, is that the interest of members and the questions that members ask are somehow disconnected to the relevant research on the issues that they are dealing with in legislation that's upcoming. Not in all cases, but I think as a general rule, there tends to be this sort of disconnect. So routine evidence plans could begin to sort of fill that gap and better connect committees and their priorities to the available evidence. This is admittedly a tough assignment for committee staff who, some folks here can already attest, are really way too busy with their current duties. And it's also the case that, that there's a danger here that this could become a partisan exercise for one side or the other in the committee structure. So that is something that has to be watched out for, and perhaps pairing this up with one of the, capacity enhancing plans that for legislative support agencies that Tim discussed might be the way to go. But having authorizers vested in this seems to be an important advance for the use of evidence. Briefly, we have an idea we think that it's important that authorizing legislation itself, the cycle of reauthorizations, be better matched up to the cycle of evidence that's generated. And this really alludes back to what Tim was talking about for infusing the authorization process with more evidence on a routine basis. Authorizations for many programs are done on a multi-year basis, 3 to 5 years for many programs like education, for housing, for job training. A range of programs have multi-year authorizations. And so if committees were more intentional about matching those cycles with the generation of evidence that Tim was talking about, that would help to sort of establish, again, the expectation that evidence would be used on a routine basis to support legislation. It's not the case that you can match all authorization cycles with evidence generation. There are many factors driving cycles of authorization. Accountability may require shorter cycles than is implied by the evidence. But as a general rule, trying to match legislative activity with that cycle of evidence is key. Finally, I want to briefly mention a sort of a different idea, and that is the idea of a portfolio review of policies on an evidence-based basis in the legislative process. Portfolio review is an opportunity for sort of a more comprehensive approach to applying evidence in the legislative process, in particular to overcome the barriers of the separate and fragmented committee jurisdictions and the standard budget structure that we see in the budget resolution. In a portfolio review, these broad portfolios such as education, poverty reduction, infrastructure investment that cut across committee jurisdictions would be examined. in sort of a comprehensive review. And an important component of such a review would be that an evidence-based analysis of how these programs are working in conjunction with one another. And the evidence would go out beyond the bounds of the usual structures of these committees and establish a strategy for perhaps organizing these programs more effectively, not in line with their current structures. This would be a heavy lift because it implies a broader restructuring of some jurisdictions or going around those jurisdictions in Congress and doing things differently than is normally done. But it does at least underscore the importance of leadership in advancing sort of a broader evidence agenda for Congress, and the idea that often the most relevant and critical evidence does not exist within the silos of the bounds of a particular agency or committee jurisdiction, but is more effective if it's broadened beyond those restrictions. So I think before I turn it over to questions here, I just think in conclusion, I think the broader point for us in doing all of this is that in our efforts to sort of create the premise that Congress should be an evidence-based institution, I think to create that culture of evidence-based policymaking in Congress, you've got to have strong capacity. You've got to have institutions modified to sort of make the evidence more transparent and create the routines through the legislative process that will make the use of evidence both a priority and a regular part of legislating. So with that, we're running a little bit behind, but we have a few minutes for some questions. Turn it over to you guys. Any questions about our options or more broadly about the report that we've worked on? Yes, we have one. We have someone with a mic, Natalie, and if you would identify yourself and who you're with. Can you ask the question?
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels, Ramsey Decision Theoretics. I've been interested in this subject for an awfully long time, given the intelligence pronouncements that we've had to contend with. When you touched on it slightly about the structures, and I'm wondering to what extent this would also require a real almost a marketing to the senators and the Congress who are have been here a long time, and I'm wondering that it's that conversation, and I'm wondering how you start that conversation and what reception you've had up to this point for that.
Well, I'll take a stab, and I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that there's broad agreement. We've had all these conversations, and there's enthusiasm across the board in both sides for applying evidence more broadly. I think the fact that Speaker Ryan and Senator Murray came together in their budget committee roles initially to the conclusion that evidence should be a foundation for the policy decisions we make. Whatever those policies may be, they should be carried out as effectively as possible. I think the difficulty comes then when you try to operationalize that. And that's when you really need, strong, hopefully bipartisan leadership to take on specific legislative initiatives. I mean, I don't want to, a perfect example is in the HELP Committee in the Senate, work on education reauthorizations between Senator Alexander and Senator Murray was critical to incorporating evidence-based initiatives in the education reauthorization. I'm going to call out my friend Ryan Martin right here, who's been involved in lots of legislative initiatives in Ways and Means in particular on a range of programs that embed evidence, but it requires a sort of targeted leadership. And I think that those are just, that's why the thrust of our ideas are around building capacity and incorporating it into the routines. And the idea that it's sort of a long-term effort. And that to be successful, it cannot ignore the politics, as Michael Steele referred to. It has to sort of live with the politics and have a seat at the table. Tim, you want to?
That's good.
So it's an ongoing effort, yes. It's right here. This lady right here had a question, and then Pete.
Hi, Stacy Bridges, Veterans Vision. With all the evidence that you do have, what if it conflicts with political agenda or special interest agenda. You can have all the evidence in the world, but a strong wrong beats a weak right any day. So what does party and agenda play with evidence and accepting the fact versus alternative facts?
I mean, sure. I think we'd be naive to say that politics don't play a role in these decisions and that Congress is a political body. I think as part of the underlying assumption of any evidence-based policymaking initiative, you have to understand that the evidence is going to needs to have a seat at the table. And this is what we're trying to push here, is the best options for Congress to make sure that evidence has a seat at the table. And that's not a guarantee that it's always going to win. And we would like it to be the case that, everyone always agreed that the underlying facts led to certain conclusions. That's just not going to be the case. And so our hope is that we can help strengthen the processes that allow evidence to play a greater role in decision making, but that's not going to get rid of the concerns that you just outlined. And in some cases, rightfully so. This is a political institution for a reason. Folks are listening to their constituents and their concerns, and they need to reflect that.
Pete, you had a question?
Hi, Pete Fontaine. I'm currently with George Washington University, formerly CBO. I'd like you, if you could say a little bit more about how you think this biennial budgeting process would work. And in particular, I guess I would start with the observation that you might say we already de facto have a biennial process where, since 2011, the Congress has done a series of 2-year fixes looking at caps and then come back to it 2 years later. So, and then in off years not having a budget resolution, as may be the case this year. So I'm wondering how, in that sort of reality of how the Congress is working, you would see this option and this idea playing out.
Right. Well, full disclosure, Pete and I worked for many years together at CBO, so we've had some discussions like this. And it's a very good question because you're right. We essentially have had 2-year budget agreements going back to about 2013, I guess. And that's in part what, sort of informs for me that a broader application of a biennial approach may be successful because we have the underpinnings now on the basis of these 2-year agreements of a solid biennial budget cycle. However, that doesn't mean that it's easy to do because what we've now got is essentially a continuous budgeting cycle with delay and ongoing use of continuing resolutions. It's as if the funding and the budgeting process never ends, and so all attention's focused on that. I think it's one thing to say we should have a biennial budget process, and I think that we should have a biennial budget process. Sticking to those boundaries is a tougher issue. It could be that there would have to be some procedural changes to sort of enforce this. There'd have to be a focus on the appropriations process to somehow try to create a discipline that would call for it to be finished in a given session and actually set aside for authorizations. It wouldn't be easy. I think ultimately it requires leadership. It requires leadership, bipartisan leadership, I think, to sort of really set the tone that you've got a successful biennial approach that drills down to the legislative level. Not just 2-year targets for discretionary spending, but drills down to the legislative level. It would not be easy, but I think it would be a much more effective way to legislate. I think we should, is there one more question back there? We'll take one more question, and I think we should, to try to stay on track, turn over to our next panel.
Hi, Amanda Myers. I'm with the Military Officers Association of America. You said earlier that policy decisions should be made first and funding decisions should be made second. And this is obviously sort of an ideal because the political reality is that, as my colleague said earlier, even if you have all the best evidence in the world, you still may not be able to argue for legitimate policy changes. And frankly, the policy discussions almost exclusively these days center around funding. And whether or not funding is available for whatever policy initiatives you may have in mind.
Right.
So with that in mind and these realities, how would you say that evidence-based practitioners should argue for their evidence to be used better or to create a culture shift to accomplish these sort of ideals in policymaking?
I mean, I would just say, just briefly, that part of our thinking in this report was that we had a range of options. Some of them are more difficult to implement than others. And part of what we're also talking about is sort of a culture change. It's not something that might necessarily happen overnight, but something that will require, I think ultimately, as with biennial budgeting, require leadership to make these things a priority. I think that some of it bubbles up from the good work that's already being done in some of the committees of Congress, where you've got a focus on particular programs that are particularly useful for evidence-based policymaking. I think just making it part of the routines slowly it's not simple, but I think making it part of the routines through this process is what's called for.
And quickly, I think you had asked about how to inject evidence into the existing process, and not so much about this ideal process that we've described. So I would also say that the second panel will be a really good place to ask that question, because a lot of these folks have worked on that exact issue. And that the AAAS also came out with a report recently about specifically targeting how scientists can better tailor their work to the policymaking process. So I'd check that out.
Perfect segue. So we are now going to turn over to our second panel, and I'm going to turn over to my colleague Dan Blair, Senior Counselor at BPC, to get that ball rolling. Invite our other panelists to come on up. Thank you.